Welcome to the history section.
Today we're beginning a thorough examination of really one of the most critical arteries in the expansion of North America, the Missouri River.
Right. And our focus is specifically on the physical challenges, the reality of navigating that stream.
Exactly. How those conditions dictated early commerce, the fur trade, and even the development of highly specialized boats.
We're here to gain a thorough understanding of the logistical realities that shape the settlement and commerce of the American West.
Which means we have to move beyond just the simple map, the geographical facts.
And confront the actual physics of it all, transporting people, goods, everything up a relentlessly turbulent and, well, mobile current.
The Missouri River is really defined by its physical dynamism. I mean, its very course is marked by these extensive windings that just don't stay still.
And during low water periods, these meanders, they multiply dramatically. The stream flows back and forth across a wider bed.
Which increases the river's overall length, significantly.
But conversely, during high water, the river shows this almost calculated efficiency. When it's fed by heavy rains or snowmelt, the sheer volume and velocity force the river to straighten itself out.
Shortening its length, which in turn increases its hydraulic slope and accelerates the current.
It's a natural self-correction, but one that's critical for the rapid and often destructive movement of floodwaters.
And the most profound metric of that power is the sheer volume of sediment it carries.
The amount of earth.
The amount of earth. History tells us that this stream annually deposits 550 million tons of earth into the Mississippi.
And that's not just local erosion, is it?
No, not at all. Researchers calculate that this sediment is transported an average distance of no less than 500 miles from where it started.
And what that means in terms of sheer work is just staggering.
It is.
The effort to transport 550 million tons of earth over 500 miles is equivalent to 275 billion mile tons of mechanical work.
Let's put that into context. If you look at the year 1901, all United States railroads combined carried about 141 billion mile tons of freight.
So the Missouri River, on its own,
was performing nearly double the freight-moving work of the entire national industrial rail system. This wasn't just a river, it was an untamed, colossal economic engine.
And the consequence of that power, of that sediment load, is this perpetual transformation of the landscape.
The river is always actively changing its environment.
Every year, thousands of acres of rich bottomlands are just destroyed.
Forests, fields, even permanent settlements fall victim as it undermines its own banks. The changes it could make in a single century, they defy what you'd normally expect from a river.
You can see the evidence of its migratory habits all over the valley.
Oh, absolutely.
And these crescent-shaped oxbow lakes, the curvilinear benches, they show you precisely where the main channel used to run.
Sometimes just a generation ago.
So when the government tried to modernize and contain it, tried to set metes and bounds to its movement with dikes and bank protection,
they very quickly found the river to be, and this is the quote, a most refractory subject.
And refractory isn't just a polite term here.
No, it means the river actively, violently resisted all attempts by modern engineering to civilize it.
So even with enormous public and private funds spent on these works, there was never any certainty that the river wouldn't just break its bonds and cut a whole new path,
destroying the engineering solutions in the process.
Let's look at the flow metrics, because it's a bit surprising. In its lower half, the river's slope is quite shallow.
Right, less than 1 foot per mile.
Yet the current velocity ranges so widely, from maybe 2 miles per hour at low water to as high as 10 during a flood stage.
And even 2 miles per hour is faster than most commercial barges operate today. 10 is a formidable torrent.
It also has this unfortunate aesthetic reputation.
Mostly because people just cross it quickly on a bridge. You look down at this muddy, eddying water, and, it doesn't compare well to a clear mountain stream.
But the travelers who had to spend weeks on its surface, they often found moments of, profound beauty.
Especially in those placid moments, morning or evening.
When the sun's rays are slanting low, you see the water mainly by reflection.
And that effect robs the water of its muddy tinge, replacing it with these hues of crimson or silver stretching to the horizon.
But it rarely stays placid for long. In its less peaceful moods, you get these persistent prairie winds,
filling the air with clouds of sand from the exposed bars.
And at the same time, the river's surface is lashed into white foam, a scene so tempestuous that small craft navigation becomes impossible.
Even the larger steamboats just had to surrender, mooring tightly to the shore until the gale passed.
That immense power, While it was economically vital for moving goods downstream, it translated into continuous life-threatening danger for anyone trying to go up it.
And when we talk about hazards, we have to start with the primary killer of river traffic: snags and sawyers.
The banks are lined with two main types of trees, right?
The willow, which matures rapidly, and the slower, sturdier cottonwood. As the current undermines the soil, these trees just fall into stream in vast numbers.
And once in the water, the trunks or branches get anchored in the river bottom, often with one end sticking up, pointing downstream.
And the rivermen had two different terms for these.
A snag was the stationary one, a piece of timber hidden just beneath the surface, a piercing threat to a hull.
And a sawyer was similar, but it was anchored loosely enough that the current made it bob up and down.
The sawing motion.
Exactly, making it appear and disappear intermittently, arguably even more terrifying.
And the only method of detection was the pilot's eyes.
Entirely. A submerged snag would create this subtle break or ripple on the surface, and in that turbulent current, spotting that break was everything.
But despite that vigilance, the research indicates something like 70% of all steamboat wrecks on the Missouri were directly from snags.
They were the most formidable and constant terror of the pilot.
Beyond the timber, there was the annual insurmountable blockade of the winter freeze.
The river freezes over, which provides this paradoxical period of stability and clarity. It's effectually enchained, as one source puts it.
But the danger comes back with exponential violence during the spring breakup.
When the ice begins to run, the immense sheets can strand on shallow bars. Then the ice behind them just piles up,
forming these massive ice gorges. Dams, really, across the stream.
And these gorges have an irresistible crushing power. They could destroy vast amounts of infrastructure along the banks.
The research notes that even dynamite was often ineffective against them.
Right. The ice accumulated so rapidly and in such density that a powerful blast would just chip away at the edges.
So humanity was basically a helpless spectator.
Until the river itself built up enough hydraulic force to burst through the dam. It happened more than once that the pressure was so great, the river was forced to cut a whole new channel around the dam.
Just eroding miles of new bank.
And the moving ice itself produced this continuous, terrifying roar from the crushing cakes. But for the early dwellers, the annual breakup, despite its violence, was probably the most welcome event of the year.
A sure sign of spring and the renewal of commerce.
Now, regarding the seasonal flow, the Missouri has two distinct, regular annual floods.
The first is in April. It's sharp, short, and often very destructive. That one's caused by local snowmelt and heavy rains along the valley floor.
And the second is the longer, more sustained June rise. This one carries an immensely greater quantity of water, but paradoxically, it usually causes less immediate damage because it's less abrupt.
And that comes from the delayed melting of deep snows in the Rocky Mountains.
But the truly exceptional floods, the catastrophic ones, they weren't caused by these regular events.
They were from long, excessive precipitation in the lower parts of the valley, far from the mountains.
Which really debunks the popular idea that all major floods came from the Rockies. The historical record confirms it was heavy, prolonged rain in the lower country that caused the worst catastrophes.
And a pilot's ability to guide a boat was constantly influenced by the weather, because navigation was all about reading the water's surface.
The riverbed, with its shifting sand drifts or bars, produced these specific, subtle appearances on the surface. Visual cues.
And that was their only guide for tracing the channel.
So anything that disturbed that surface disturbed the pilot's ability to function. Wind, surprisingly, was less troublesome than rain.
Why is that?
Because wind tends to ruffle deep water more than shallow water, which still leaves some, distorted but useful indication of where the channel lies.
Ah, I see. But rain.
Rain reduced all water appearances to a common, confused level. It made channel reading virtually impossible.
A slanting sun was also a problem, especially below 45 degrees.
The reflection. It would blind the pilot to the subtle breaks from snags or the definition of the shallow bars.
Captain La Barge, a famous pilot, he recorded a curious fact about nighttime navigation.
He found the Missouri much easier to read than the Mississippi on a dark night.
How so?
He described the Mississippi as looking black at night, which just made everything darker. The Missouri, conversely, had a distinct whitish tinge.
A faint, ghostly light on its surface.
Exactly. And this unique visual difference gave experienced pilots a crucial slight advantage under moonlight or starlight.
Finally, the entire river corridor was prone to violent summer storms.
A defining feature of the plains climate. These were frightful storms, often with tornado tendencies, intense thunder, and large hail.
So when these storms gathered, the rivermen would make for the shore, losing no time in finding shelter under a high bank.
And because they generally came from the southwest, the rule was to tie up for the night on the southwest, or right shore, to use the bank for protection.
Accidents from these tempests were common.
Catastrophic, often. Boats torn from their moorings, driven onto bars, smokestacks, decks, pilot houses carried away, windows destroyed by hail the size of turkey eggs.
Now let's move chronologically back. These striking physical characteristics, this raw power, it produced a profound impression on the first Europeans.
The official discovery of the confluence was in 1673, Marquette and Joliet floating down the Mississippi.
And they encountered this massive influx of water from the west, carrying trees, stumps, drift of all kinds.
It filled them with amazement at this spectacle of untamed natural force.
And while the confluence was noted in 1673, entry into the Missouri by Europeans likely began around the year 1700.
French progress was slow but deliberate, and it soon alarmed the Spanish authorities who claimed the territories to the west.
So in 1720, the Spanish sent a large military expedition
Intended to destroy the Missouri indigenous peoples who were allies of the French fur traders.
But that expedition was destroyed in turn by the Missouri people before it achieved its goal.
Which spurred the French to establish a post in response. They set up Fort Orleans about 200 miles upriver.
And this is considered the first permanent structure erected by Europeans along the stream.
As for the name, it originates directly from that tribe. The word simply means dwelling near the mouth of the river.
It defines their position relative to the Mississippi. And crucially, contrary to popular assumption, it has no reference whatsoever to the muddy quality of the water.
No, it's purely geographical.
And geographically, the river presents a paradox. If measured from its farthest headwaters, the Missouri is physically longer than the entire Mississippi.
Which leads to the argument that the lower Mississippi should actually be named the Missouri.
But the nomenclature remains distinct. The Mississippi is seen as the ultimate trunk stream, dividing the continent. The Missouri is the great western tributary.
Just as the Ohio is the great eastern tributary.
Throughout the 18th century, the French extended their knowledge and trade. By the time St. Louis was founded in 1764, the river was well known for 1,000 miles.
So when Lewis and Clark ascended in 1804, they found that Europeans had already preceded them, trading almost to the junction of the Yellowstone River.
The swiftness, the turbidity, the danger of the Missouri meant that early commerce relied on simple, incredibly robust craft.
Each one tailored for a specific mission and a specific location.
We can start with the simplest form, the wooden canoe or dugout.
Made from local logs, cottonwood, walnut, cedar, usually 15 to 20 feet long, though some freighting canoes could reach 30 feet.
The construction was primitive but efficient. A log was felled, hewn down, then hollowed out with the tilrond around adze.
And they left a surprisingly thin shell, about 2 inches thick at the bottom, tapering to 1 inch at the rim.
And to give it strength, they left solid partitions, or bulkheads, in place at intervals down the length of the hull.
Right, for transverse strength. A good-sized canoe could be built by 4 skilled men in just 4 days.
Propulsion was mostly manual, by paddle, the Avern, a crew of 3. Square sails were only used with a strictly aft wind.
Because the canoe was so unstable, a side wind risked immediate capsizing.
But larger versions existed, the pirogue, for instance.
Which often meant 2 canoes rigidly united in parallel and then completely floored over.
Creating a much wider, more stable platform.
Exactly. It could carry more cargo and, crucially, allowed the use of sails even with a quartering wind without that constant danger of overturning.
And the primary uses of the canoe were for local business, express messages, and some specialized freight.
A notable example was bear's oil. It was prized in St. Louis as a lard substitute.
And the oil was so penetrating it would filter through most containers.
So they sealed a central compartment of the canoe itself with a stretched skin, making the boat the container. Honey was also transported this way.
The second key craft was the Mackinac boat, which dominated downstream navigation.
Much larger vessels, up to 50 feet long, 12-foot beam, flat bottom, elliptical shape.
And critically, they were built cheaply, with wooden pins instead of nails.
Because they were explicitly intended for a single, one-way trip downriver. Once in St. Louis, they were disassembled or sold for $4 or $5.
A cost recovery for the lumber.
The central cargo compartment was sealed by watertight bulkheads, holding about 15 tons and covered with lodge skins.
The crew was 5 men, 4 oarsmen, and 1 patron. or steersman.
And because of the powerful current, the labor was comparatively light. They could make 75 to 150 miles a day.
So the cost of transport was remarkably low.
About $2 per day per man. Construction happened at temporary boatyards or chantiers, and since sawmills were non-existent, the lumber was sawed by hand by 2 men on a scaffold.
The third crucial craft was the bullboat, designed for an incredibly difficult environment.
The excessively shallow tributaries, like the Platte or the Cheyenne, where anything drawing more than 9 or 10 inches was useless. It was arguably the lightest draft vessel ever constructed for its load-carrying capacity, about 30 feet long by 12 feet wide.
And its construction was all about flexibility and organic materials. A frame of willow poles lashed with rawhide. No metal at all.
The covering was a continuous sheet of rawhide, and it's a critical detail that only skins from buffalo bulls were used.
For the thickness and strength needed to resist the abrasion from dragging on the sandy bottom.
The hides were soaked, stretched tight as a drumhead over the frame, and the seams were pitched with a mix of buffalo tallow and ashes to keep it watertight.
Navigation was handled by just 2 men with long poles.
And when it launched in the morning, it drew incredibly little water, maybe 4 inches. But the hide would absorb water, so the draft would increase to 6 or 8 inches by evening.
Which meant it had to be unloaded every single night.
Placed bottom up on the bank to dry, which conveniently also served as a shelter for the crew and the cargo of furs.
The cargo itself was placed on loose poles inside to keep it elevated from any leakage.
For bullboats, low water was often preferred to high water because a swift current made it impossible to pole against.
A major hazard was gliding into deep pockets in the river bottom where the poles couldn't touch,
forcing them to drift helplessly. And strong prairie winds were another problem. A steady gale could literally blow most of the water to one side of the stream,
leaving the crew stranded on a sandbar if the wind changed overnight.
And we should contrast these large cargo bullboats with the small hemispherical tubs used by some indigenous peoples, like the Mandans.
Those are personal ferries, really. One person, one hide, mostly used by women to transport meat downstream.
Exactly, not commercial freighters.
Before steam power, the keelboat was the definitive primary commerce vessel for the upper Missouri.
It was used to transport essential merchandise far upriver for the trade and was the chosen vessel for all important military or exploring expeditions.
These were staunch, good-sized boats, built on a regular model with a true keel.
Typically 60 to 70 feet long, 15 to 18-foot beam, and requiring a draft of 20 to 30 inches when loaded.
And the construction was professional, often happening in places like Pittsburgh. They were expensive, costing $2,000 to $3,000.
The design was highly specialized. It featured a large cargo box in the center of the boat.
And along each side of that box ran a crucial, narrow walk, the passe avant.
Only about 15 inches wide, but absolutely essential as the stage for the grueling labor of propulsion.
And the primary method for that upstream ascent was the cordel,
which involved a line nearly 1,000 feet long attached to the top of a 30-foot mast.
And this long, heavy line was pulled by a crew of 20 to 40 men walking along the shore.
The long line and the high mast, that was an ingenious engineering solution.
It minimized the tendency of the line to pull the boat too sharply toward shore and kept it clear of the dense bank brush.
Right. It prevented snagging. In sections where the bank was impassable, they resorted to warping.
A few men would carry the end of the line ahead, make it fast to a tree, and the crew on board would haul the boat up.
And when cordelling was impractical, say on shallow sandbars or soft mud where the men couldn't walk,
they were forced to resort to the pole, the most physically demanding method of all.
This was intensive, synchronized labor, a line of 8 to 10 men on the narrow pass avant,
each with an ash pole fitted with a knob to rest in his shoulder.
At the command of les perches, down with the poles, they'd thrust them into the river bottom and push, walking toward the stern.
And to repeat, the patron would command levez les perches, raise the poles, and the men would walk quickly back to the bow.
Cleats were nailed to the walk for traction, and the steering could only happen in the brief moments when the poles were withdrawn from the mud.
Oars were used sparingly, but a surprisingly critical reliance was the sail.
A square sail of about 100 square feet. Because the river's sinuous course bent around so much, you frequently encountered an aft or quartering breeze.
And this was proven spectacularly by Manuel Lisa's boat in 1811.
He rounded the Great Bend with a continuous aft wind all the way, making an astonishing 75 miles in a single day using only the sail.
But despite that, progress was generally agonizingly slow. Lisa's exceptional voyage averaged only about 18 miles a day. A typical trip took an entire summer.
The laborers, the voyagers, worked to the limit of endurance. Their food was basic: salted pork, lied corn, navy beans.
Yet the accounts describe them as universally cheerful and lighthearted. They often spent evenings dancing and singing around the campfire.
The St. Louis Creoles in particular were considered the preferred boatmen for the specific synchronized labor required.
The introduction of the steamboat marked a permanent rupture with the past.
Some romantics lamented it, fearing it would end the river's natural romance, but the steamboat created an entirely new and equally impressive scene.
The appearance of the Missouri River steamboat was striking. It drew only 3 or 4 feet of water, so it looked massive for its tonnage.
Typically painted white, rising high above the water with successive deck spoiler, Hurricane Texas, and the lofty pilot house. A floating palace.
The indigenous peoples viewed it with awe, calling it the fire canoe.
And its power to conquer a current that defied 40 men pulling a rope that reportedly influenced their favor toward the Americans, a sign of technological superiority.
The earliest steamcraft, like the Independence in 1819, were side-wheelers. They still had a model keel and drew 6 feet of water, which was too deep.
The defining vessel of the era was the modern first-class steamboat, a design perfected for the Missouri.
These were about 220 feet long, 35 feet wide, carrying 500 tons, and they had an absolutely flat bottom.
Which allowed for an incredibly low draft, about 30 inches light, only 50 inches loaded. Propulsion was a massive stern wheel powered by dual engines.
They were also equipped with specialized gear, huge spars, 60 to 80 feet long, attached to steam capstans.
Used for sparring the boat over sandbars, essentially using the spars as giant steam-powered legs to lift and walk the vessel forward.
A mechanized version of pulling.
Exactly. They also had tramway cars in the hold for freight and enormous stages on derricks for reaching high, crumbling banks.
And the pilot house was elevated far above the Texas deck for optimal viewing of the critical channel ahead.
The Missouri River pilot was widely considered the most skillful representative of his profession,
surpassing even the Mississippi or ocean navigators.
The constantly shifting channel, the swift current, the hidden snags, it all demanded quick perception and bold action.
The pilot had to maintain constant connection with the engine room. The system of signal bells was used almost continuously.
And these pilots had an extraordinary working knowledge of the entire 2,600 miles of river. They meticulously swapped notes with other boats about the shifting channel,
treating that information as essential proprietary data.
A persistent problem, even with steam, was fuel. The boats relied entirely on wood, primarily cottonwood, which was poor firewood when green.
So they couldn't reach a wood yard. The crew had to gather drift logs or even burn the buildings of abandoned trading posts.
As traffic became regular, established wood yards developed, sometimes run by indigenous peoples as a source of revenue.
And during periods of hostility, between 1860 and 1876, the act of wooding became a perilous activity.
To counter this, Captain La Barge devised an innovative solution. He equipped one of his boats with a portable sawmill and hired oxen.
The team would drag logs aboard while the boat was underway, allowing the crew to saw fuel and feed the furnaces as they steamed ahead, minimizing vulnerable stationary time.
Operational hours were relentless, daybreak to twilight, often 3 a.m. to 9 p.m.
If winds forced a halt, the time was used for cutting wood. Running at night was only attempted in the most urgent situations.
And when the boat inevitably grounded on a sandbar, getting it off was intricate.
The spars were lowered, planted in the sand, attached to the steam capstans, and the boat was meticulously walked over the bar.
A process that could sometimes take 1 or 2 entire days.
There was also a subtle technique, wasn't there? Reversing the wheel.
Yes, to temporarily dam the water flowing over the bar. This could raise the water level by up to 4 inches, providing the necessary clearance to aid the spars. A very sophisticated method.
Genuine rapids were passed by a version of the old keelboat warping.
They'd run to shore, bury a heavy timber anchor, a dead man, and then winch the boat up the incline with the steam capstan.
And true whirlpools presented an extreme hazard.
In 1867, the Bishop was swamped in an immense eddy. Around the same time, the Miner narrowly escaped a whirl near Sioux City where the center was nearly 12 feet below its circumference.
The boat was spun violently, careened over until water flowed across the lower deck, and 2 crew members were swept overboard.
During the era of peak competition around 1858, racing became a highly risky pastime.
The chief danger was overpressurizing the boilers far beyond safe limits.
6 major boiler explosions are recorded. The most terrible was the destruction of the Saluda on April 9, 1852 at Lexington, Missouri.
The river was high, the current strong, and the boat had been tied up for days, unable to round a difficult bend.
Captain Francis F. Belt, frustrated by the delay, recklessly ordered more steam, declaring he would round the bend or blow the boat to pieces.
When the lines were cast off, the engines made only 1 or 2 revolutions before the boilers burst.
The explosion blew the boat into splinters. Over 100 people were killed, including many officers and passengers.
Captain La Barge's brother, Charles, was piloting the vessel.
And the sheer violence is underscored by a terrifying detail. The boat's bell was reportedly blown clean onto the bank while it was still ringing.
As passenger traffic increased, table fare improved, but game remained vital, especially deep in indigenous country.
Skilled professional hunters were employed, men like Henry Chatillon and Louis Dauphin.
They would leave the boat hours before the 3 a.m. start to scour the riverbank, well ahead.
When an animal was killed, it was hung in a conspicuous spot for retrieval by the steamboat yawl hours later.
Louis Dauphin, La Barge's favorite hunter, was known for his skill, but his lack of prudence cost him his life. He was culled by the Sioux in 1865.
The cargo for the upper river was a mix of fur trade goods, government annuities, and military supplies.
And the passengers were a heterogeneous mixture. Crew, soldiers, trappers, returning indigenous peoples, and scientific parties, like Audubon's.
The departure from St. Louis was often accompanied by considerable carousing. The American Fur Company implemented strict measures to prevent desertion,
Paying wages conditionally and distributing clothing only after the boat had left port.
A critical pre-voyage ritual for the engages was settling the informal championship for physical prowess.
Since the crew were often strangers, friction was common until one man was recognized as the strongest.
Veteran mountaineer Etienne Provost often took charge, forming a ring on the forecastle to force every braggart to prove his claims. The winner got a red belt.
Right. Captain La Barge recalled an incident in 1863 involving an American known as Yankee Jack, who was being harassed by the crew.
With the captain's permission, Jack quickly settled the matter in the forecastle ring, defeating his 2 main harassers. After that, he was left unmolested for the rest of the voyage.
The shift to steam wasn't just curiosity. It was an economic necessity for the American Fur Company.
They saw the slow keelboats as a severe handicap. The cost, the delay, the risk of the river icing over.
So the plan, proposed in 1830, was revolutionary. Use a steamboat to drastically shorten the transit time.
It would ensure goods arrived early and, crucially, would let the company keep its employees in indigenous country over the winter, paying them in merchandise, not cash.
The first fur trade steamboat was the Yellowstone, built for $7,000 or $8,000.
Her 1831 maiden voyage, however, failed to reach the Yellowstone River due to low water. Pierre Chouteau Jr., a company principal, had to wait impatiently on the bluffs,
which gave rise to the name Chouteau Bluffs.
The 1832 voyage, though, was fully successful, reaching Fort Union, 1,700 miles further upriver.
This decisively demonstrated the viability of steam. The return trip averaged 100 miles a day. George Catlin, the painter, was a passenger.
Moving forward to a later voyage, the Omega set out in 1843 with Captain La Barge as pilot.
And the famous ornithologist John James Audubon and his party were passengers.
The crucial issue on this trip was smuggling liquor. Its importation was prohibited by federal law, and zealous inspectors, often clergymen, were stationed at key points like Bellevue.
But the traders considered alcohol indispensable for trade and never failed to smuggle it through.
The inspection at Bellevue in 1843 was particularly tricky. The agent was absent but had delegated the duty to Captain Burgwin, commander of the local troops.
So to buy time, Audubon, using his own fame, volunteered to visit the officers' camp 4 miles away, pretending to present his credentials.
And his efforts successfully secured 2 essential hours of delay,
which was immediately capitalized upon. Captain Sire's boat had a unique shallow hold with a narrow-gauge tramway system inside.
The crew quickly loaded all the illegal liquor onto miniature tramway cars and ran them into the darkest recesses of the hold, concealing them from the light of the main hatch.
When Captain Burgwin finally arrived, he was wined and dined with some of Audubon's private legal stash, softening his resolve.
The virtuous sire, as he was called, then insisted on the strictest possible search.
And as the candlelit search party gripped along one side of the hold,
the crew stealthily used the tramway system in the darkness, creeping the train of illegal cargo around to the side that had just been searched. A masterful misdirection.
The inspection concluded with nothing found. But the trip wasn't without other peril.
At Handy's Point, a band of Santee indigenous people opened fire when the boat refused to stop. Bullets tore through the cabins and pilot house, miraculously hitting no one.
Black Dave, a veteran pilot, was in the pilot house when the bullets crashed through. He quietly walked out and took shelter behind a smokestack.
When asked why, he said his concern wasn't the bullets, but protecting his eyesight, his livelihood, from flying glass.
Audubon's demeanor during the voyage was reserved and often seen as overbearing.
Yes, which made him unpopular. La Barge recounts an incident with a black squirrel he shot for Audubon.
After receiving the fine specimen, Audubon condescendingly criticized La Barge for not knowing the proper names of animals in his own country.
But La Barge later learned through Audubon's assistant that the naturalist had privately praised the specimen, calling it the best specimen of a black squirrel that he had ever painted.
Another instance of intellectual arrogance was deflated by the guide, Etienne Provost.
Audubon's botanist, a Mr. Prow, boasted he could identify any plant from a single leaf.
So Provost tricked him. He presented a single-leaf blade of corn, sprouted from a dropped kernel, but artfully concealed the kernel itself.
The eager botanist racked his brain for hours, consulted his books, and finally admitted defeat, failing to identify the common agricultural plant.
Provost then revealed the simple kernel of corn to the humiliated scientist.
In 1844, the American Fur Company launched the Nimrod. This voyage coincided with the greatest flood ever known on the lower Missouri, the Great Flood of 1844.
This was catastrophic on the lower river, covering bottomlands, cutting new channels.
And it served as yet another refutation of the idea that all major floods came from the Rockies. This was clearly a local phenomenon.
The evidence was clear to the upper rivermen. As the Nimrod ascended, she had to wait for a water rise near the Omaha villages,
proving the devastating floodwaters inundating the lower valley hadn't extended that far upriver yet.
The Nimrod carried several intriguing passengers, including the wealthy Comte de Trant, son of Napoleon's minister of police. He was popular and engaging.
In stark contrast was the enigmatic Comte de Pendry, a rumored duelist forced to leave Paris. He was silent, reserved, and spent much of his time hunting alone.
The 1844 smuggling attempt past Bellevue required even greater ingenuity. A zealous new agent, Joseph Miller, was piercing bales of goods with a slender rod.
So Captain Sire packed the alcohol in ordinary flour barrels, marked PAS for Peter A. Sarpy, the company's agent at Bellevue.
The barrels were ostentatiously unloaded at Bellevue in broad daylight, as if they were Sarpy's provisions. Agent Miller searched the boat, found nothing, and secured it for the night.
But well after midnight, La Barge engineered the reload. The crew spread thick tarpaulins on the deck to muffle the noise and silently hoisted all the barrels back aboard.
When the guard finally noticed them preparing to move, La Barge seized an axe, cut the mooring line, and steamed away at full speed, later claiming the line had parted,
leaving a duped and enraged agent on the shore.
The voyage brought its usual share of hardships. 2 ocean sailors got lost while hunting and were found 2 weeks later near starvation, hiding in a fort they'd built from an abandoned woodpile.
And there was an infamous buffalo mishap. La Barge took mate John Dirac, who had no river hunting experience, to lasso a wounded bull.
Dirac mistakenly roped an uninjured, immensely powerful bull instead.
The animal towed their yawl straight to shore at high speed until the strain wrenched the stem of the boat clean off, leaving them shipwrecked on a sandbar.
The trip concluded with a near catastrophe on June 23rd. A frightful tempest of wind, hail the size of turkey eggs, and blinding rain.
The storm carried away the pilot house, which had to be replaced with a temporary skin roof, and broke all the glass on the windward side of the boat.
It's a dramatic underscore of the perpetual hazards of the river.
For passengers enduring the long journey, the pilot house was a favorite resort.
Here, the pilots would provide vivid narratives detailing the history of the land.
They'd recount stories of historical sites, attacks by indigenous people, and delays caused by massive herds of migrating buffalo crossing the river.
The voyage, while often monotonous, offered this unique blend of commerce, peril, and tradition that ocean travel just lacked.
The arrival of the annual boat was always a momentous event for the remote trading posts and forts.
It provided an essential, if brief, connection to civilization, bringing news, supplies, and new people.
The exchange of cargo was carried on with the utmost dispatch before the boat continued its rapid journey.
The history of the Missouri River steamboat business, especially during the Montana Gold Rush, represents a dramatic, essential, and highly specialized chapter in American frontier history.
It remains a romantic and picturesque memory, defining the successful logistical conquest of the vast Western territory through technological ingenuity and extraordinary human effort.
We're looking at a really foundational period for American expansion, specifically focusing on the Missouri River trade.
That's right. The research points to a very clear turning point, a time when the entire purpose of the river seems to shift.
And that turning point is right around 1845. Before that, the business on the river was, well, it was extremely narrow.
It was. It was almost entirely dominated by one single industry.
The fur trade. Steamboat commerce was really just a support system for these remote trading posts.
Mostly run by the American Fur Company. Any other traffic was, almost an afterthought, just minor service to a few lower river settlements
And Fort Leavenworth, the government outpost.
Right. And while there was a packet service, technically, between St. Louis and Leavenworth, it was never really consistent.
It ran off and on from about 1829 to 1844, but it wasn't a reliable commercial line.
Not at all. The entire rhythm of the river was slow, very seasonal. The one single major event of the year was the fur company's big voyage.
The one that went all the way up to the mouth of the Yellowstone River.
Exactly. One big steamer loaded with supplies and trade goods. It was more a feat of endurance and navigation than a regular business model.
It represented extraction, really. Pulling furs out of the wilderness, not bringing civilization in.
And then everything changes. Around 1845, the character of the business undergoes this profound shift.
It moves away from just supporting traders and starts facilitating, well, the foundation of permanent European settlements in the far west.
The demand completely changes. It's no longer just for traps and blankets. Now it's for plows, timber, families.
Military supplies, everything you need to build a society. The river becomes a logistical backbone.
And the first real stress test of this new capacity, the first large-scale movement, was the Mormon emigration.
That's the key development, isn't it? It's the event that really proves the Missouri can handle mass transport.
It proves the river can handle continuous, large-scale passenger and heavy freight traffic far beyond the old frontier. It was a type of demand that, simply hadn't existed before.
It really sets the precedent for everything that follows.
To understand that logistical challenge, you have to look at the history of the people themselves. The sect was founded in 1830 by Joseph Smith in Fayette, New York.
And right from the start, their communal living and religious practices created tension with their neighbors.
Which led to their first major move to Kirtland, Ohio. They were trying to establish their New Jerusalem.
At the same time, they also chose a second refuge, way out on the frontier, 12 miles west of Independence, Missouri. They called it Zion.
So the goal was always separation, self-governance, and that, of course, led to more conflict.
The pressure in Kirtland became too much. Hostility, financial failures with their community bank.
Yeah.
They were eventually forced to flee Ohio.
And they congregated in Missouri. This is where things became much, much more serious.
Tensions over land, political influence. It all boiled over very quickly.
The history tells us that these conflicts in Missouri went far beyond typical frontier disputes. It took on the aspects of a civil war.
You had local militias involved, mob violence.
Real bloodshed and significant loss of property. The hostility was so deep that they were eventually formally expelled from the state of Missouri.
So Smith and the other leaders were arrested, but the refugees found a new place to settle near Commerce, Illinois.
And this is where they build Nauvoo. They secure a state charter that is, well, remarkably favorable.
The power the charter gave them in 1841 was extraordinary.
It was. Smith became mayor. He became lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion.
Which was a substantial, well-armed militia.
And he was president of the church. So you have religious, civic, and military authority all rolled into one person.
It created what was effectively a state within a state.
An imperium, an imperio. And that created immense political friction with the other residents of Illinois. They saw this autonomous, armed, rapidly growing power block in their midst.
And tragically, the same problems repeated themselves. The perception of an obnoxious doctrine, defiance of local authority.
It led to disaster, just as it had before. The crisis really came to a head over the destruction of an opposition newspaper, which Smith had ordered.
This led to his arrest, along with his brother Hiram. They were confined in the Carthage jail.
And despite a promise of protection from the governor, a mob stormed the jail and murdered both brothers in cold blood in June of 1844.
But this act of violence didn't break the movement.
No, quite the opposite. This martyrdom actually healed some internal divisions that had been growing. It intensified their purpose.
And it created the need for a new single leader to emerge.
And that leader was Brigham Young. He very quickly established himself as this astute, clear-headed organizer.
Captain La Barge's later assessment of him is really interesting.
It is. La Barge knew him from their business dealings and saw him not necessarily as a religious fanatic, but as a man of immense practical ability.
A pragmatic director who could channel the zeal of his followers toward these monumental physical goals.
Exactly. So Young looks at the situation persecution in 3 different states and determines there's no future for them within the United States.
He selects the Valley of the Great Salt Lake, which at that point was still Mexican territory.
Believing that total isolation was their only hope for freedom, the general exodus begins in the spring of 1846.
Though it's not until July of 1847 that Young actually lays the foundation for the new settlement.
But for our story, the critical point is that the area near Council Bluffs and Omaha becomes this massive rendezvous point.
A geographical bottleneck. And that makes the river, the route from St. Louis up to Council Bluffs, the essential logistical artery for the whole movement.
And the steamboat traffic just explodes. We're talking about thousands of people needing transport.
And not just people. All their possessions, tools, seeds, machinery, everything needed to found a new civilization from scratch.
The scale is just immense. You have specific boats working at maximum capacity. The steamer San Ange carried 200 people in a single trip in 1851.
The Sacramento carried 400.
Right. This wasn't just a one-off trip. It was a sustained, scheduled mass transit system for people and foundational freight that went on for a full decade.
It really trained the river operators and set the stage for what was to come.
And through all this, Captain La Barge's view of Brigham Young is quite telling. He dealt with him extensively.
And he found him to be fair, honest in his transactions, a very pragmatic commercial mind.
What really stood out to La Barge was that Young was an executive first and a prophet second. He saw him as someone capable of directing the fanaticism of others to achieve these highly organized, practical ends.
Like building a commonwealth in the middle of a desert.
Precisely.
So the Mormon movement proves the river's capacity, but then almost immediately, other geopolitical forces come into play.
Right. A whole new layer of demand gets added, which cements the Missouri's role as the primary highway west. And the first of these is the war with Mexico.
Kicking off in 1846 as a direct result of the U.S. annexation of Texas in 45.
When American troops moved into disputed territory, war was inevitable. And the consequences of this war for Western expansion were just enormous.
The U.S. military conquers these vast new territories. New Mexico, California.
Under commanders like Harney, Doniphan, and Fremont. And all of this newly acquired land lies directly in the path of this growing Western migration.
And the military expeditions themselves created immediate and very lucrative work for the steamboats.
The invasion of New Mexico, for example, followed the Santa Fe Trail. But to stage that invasion, you needed massive amounts of men and supplies.
And the organization points for these expeditions were all on the river. Fort Leavenworth, Fort Kearny, St. Joseph.
These places were entirely dependent on river transport to get the troops, the artillery, the provisions in place. The steamboats became an integral part of executing national military policy.
And then the ink is barely dry on the treaty ending the war.
When gold is discovered in California in 1848, and that just revolutionizes the situation all over again.
If the Mormon migration was a massive flow, the gold rush was a flood.
A demographic explosion is the right term for it. The overland movement that starts in 1849 and peaks through 54 is one of the largest migrations in recorded history.
And almost all of them use the river for that first crucial leg of the journey.
Steamboats brought huge numbers of emigrants, the 49ers, and all their freight disassembled wagons, mining tools, to the rendezvous points.
The Westport, Leavenworth, Fort Kearny, Omaha, these towns just swelled into these frenetic commercial hubs.
And they were totally dependent on the river. The boats were like a conveyor belt delivering the human and material capital for the California dream.
But the research notes that this early trade was difficult for the captains.
Very difficult financially. La Barge observed that many of the first wave of travelers were poor. They had scraped together just enough to make the journey.
So collecting fares and freight charges was a real challenge.
It was a high-risk business. Once those emigrants left the river and headed onto the plains, there was no way to collect a debt. Captains were essentially extending credit, betting on their success in the gold fields.
It stabilized later, of course, as gold started flowing back. But that initial period was very chaotic.
La Barge himself was successful enough with his steamboating that he resisted the craze, as he called it.
He saw the other side of it, didn't he?
He did. From his vantage point on the river, he saw thousands of disheartened adventurers already turning back, defeated before they even reached the mountains. He figured there were many chances of failure to just one of success.
So we have these three forces, the Mormons, the military, and the gold rush, all converging on the river.
And you can visualize the whole system like a fan. The handle of the fan is that critical 400-mile stretch of the river from St. Louis up to the mouth of the Kansas River.
The choke point.
Exactly. And then the arms of the fan diverge out along the overland trails, Santa Fe, California, Oregon.
And almost all the business on that handle, on the river portion, was handled by steamboats. They were run in huge numbers.
Departing St. Louis daily, carrying this, almost inconceivable variety of goods and people, it was truly the golden era of steamboating on the Missouri.
And a central figure in all this was Captain Joseph La Barge.
Absolutely. He was one of the key figures who learned to master this incredibly volatile river and adapt to all these new demands.
He buys his first boat in 1846, the General Brooks, but quickly upgrades.
Right. In 1847, he supervises the building of the Martha in Cincinnati, a boat designed for the heavy freight of the American Fur Company. And that year, he's in full charge of their annual upriver voyage.
And that 1847 voyage was carrying a particularly heavy and sensitive cargo.
It was. Regular trade freight, but also large quantities of government annuities for various indigenous peoples' tribes.
And this annuity system was a source of constant problems.
A huge source of friction and exploitation. The government agents sent to distribute these goods often had no military protection, which made them very vulnerable.
And the company traders took full advantage of that.
They would manipulate the agents' fears, convince them to just deposit the annuities at the company trading posts for safekeeping.
Which gave the company control over government resources, and they profited massively from it.
There's a specific example with an agent Matlock. He was supposed to deliver annuities to the Yankton Sioux at Crow Creek.
But the company agent convinced him to just leave them at Fort Pierre, a company post, which was much farther away for the Yankton.
Right. It caused a lot of confusion and resentment, and this discontent often led to direct confrontations.
Like at Crow Creek itself.
Exactly. The indigenous people there were so frustrated they just sat on a wood pile the company men had cut, refusing to let it be loaded onto the Martha without payment.
So La Barge was forced to pay them for the wood.
He was. But the tension didn't end there. A man named Etienne Provost, who La Barge employed to manage the mountain men, shouted, "Woodpile!" as a kind of sarcastic signal.
And as the crew started loading, a dozen or so indigenous men attacked them with rawhide horsewhips.
The crew dropped their wood, scrambled back to the boat. Provost apparently thought this was hilarious.
But then he went ashore himself.
He did. He ordered the men back to work and then challenged the indigenous people directly, asking them, "Why don't you stop them? Are you afraid of me?"
And they were. They respected and feared him, so they let the loading finish. It's a strange incident that shows the complex personal dynamics on the frontier.
It gets much worse later that day, though.
This is the attack on the Martha.
Yes. The boat was anchored, waiting for a strong wind to die down, when a heavy volley of gunfire hit the boat. A deckhand, Charles Smith, was killed instantly.
And this wasn't a random, disorganized attack.
No, not at all. The attackers immediately flooded the boiler grates with water. They knew exactly how to disable a steamboat.
By putting out the fires, it rendered the vessel helpless.
They took possession of the forward part of the boat, demanding surrender. La Barge acted fast. He secured his wife first, having John Sarpy barricade their stateroom door with mattresses.
And then he remembered a small cannon they had on board.
A light cannon, about 2.5-inch caliber, that was being repaired in the engine room. The chief engineer, Nathan Grismore, hoisted it up to the after cabin.
But they didn't have any proper shot for it.
So they improvised. They loaded it heavily with boiler rivets, a moment of true ingenuity under fire.
And then La Barge used it as a threat.
He took a lit cigar, made sure he was seen, and had a crewman warn the attackers that he was about to blow them all to the devil.
The effect was, as he said, complete and instantaneous.
A total panic. They retreated immediately. But when La Barge looked for his brave crew,
he found them hiding on the side wheels, packed thick as sardines. He was disgusted by their lack of courage.
The journey resumed, and they buried Charles Smith the next morning. La Barge said it was the only time he was ever caught napping by the indigenous peoples.
And on that same voyage, his wife made her own history.
Mrs. La Barge. She's believed to be the first European woman to travel all the way up to Fort Union at the mouth of the Yellowstone.
Her presence must have caused a stir.
It caused immense curiosity. The indigenous peoples would examine her, measure her waist, the length of her hair. Several leading women actually adopted her as their sister and corresponded with her for years.
A remarkable connection.
The dangers weren't just on the frontier, though. The river terminals themselves were hazardous.
The Great Fire of St. Louis in 1849.
La Barge was returning from Fort Leavenworth on the St. Ange, and was delayed by a storm, which turned out to be incredibly fortunate.
He arrived after midnight to see the city glowing. The fire had started around 10 p.m. on another steamer, the White Cloud.
And a strong wind pushed the burning boats into the others. A vast fleet of burning vessels just drifted down the wharf.
23 steamboats destroyed.
La Barge wisely tied up across the river at Bloody Island. And among the wrecks was the Martha, his old boat, fully loaded for a trip to the mountains.
And right after that fire came the great cholera scourge of 1849, a devastating 1-2 punch for the city and the river trade.
It was. But despite all that, the trade continued to get more efficient. In 1850, La Barge made the round trip to the Yellowstone in a record 28 days.
So on to 1851. This voyage highlights the constant presence of disease.
The Saint-Onge left St. Louis in June during a dangerous flood with malarial conditions everywhere. On board were 2 Jesuit missionaries,
Father Christian Hocken and the famous Father de Smet.
Sickness hit almost immediately. De Smet himself was laid low by a severe bilious fever. But then cholera broke out about 500 miles upriver.
And people started dying daily.
Dr. Evans, a scientist from the Smithsonian, was on board and did what he could, but it was Father Hocken who worked tirelessly, tending to the sick.
And he exhausted himself.
He did. He was stricken with cholera himself. In his final moments, he confessed to the very ill Father de Smet.
And de Smet gave him the last rites.
And then, in a really poignant moment, de Smet, fearing he was next, confessed to the dying Hocken.
Hocken died on June 19th, and Captain La Barge, against the protests of the other passengers, insisted on bringing his body back to St. Louis for a proper burial.
A real act of respect and courage. Afterwards, La Barge took drastic measures, put everyone ashore, aired all the baggage, completely cleaned the boat, and that, combined with getting into more arid territory, finally stopped the plague.
And Father de Smet recovered and continued his mission. He was a remarkable figure.
He was. Known for his courage and especially his incredible popularity with the indigenous peoples, they called him the Black Robe.
And his reputation alone could stop conflicts.
There's the story near the Poplar River. A band of Blackfeet, who were notoriously hostile, approached the boat in an ugly temper.
La Barge advised de Smet to stay on the boat.
But de Smet put on his cassock, held up his crucifix, and walked toward them. As soon as they recognized the Black Robe, their hostility vanished.
They carried him back to the boat and accepted a feast from La Barge. The threat was completely diffused.
Then there's the even more striking story at the Arikara villages,
where they were suffering from a drought.
Yes. The chief, White Shield, asked if the Black Robe could send us rain. De Smet just laughed and said he would pray.
He visited the village, offered a prayer, and soon after, a huge thunderstorm deluged the area.
A French-Canadian living with the tribe, Pierre Garreau, was so convinced de Smet had a secret art for making rain that he offered him 10 horses to reveal it.
And de Smet just told him to be a good Christian and pray.
Exactly.
So all of this is happening as the commercial push to the farthest reaches of the river continues, particularly into Blackfeet territory.
Right. The Blackfeet were major fur producers, but also, as we've heard, inveterate enemies of Europeans. Every attempt to trade with them before 1831 had failed, often violently.
But Kenneth Mackenzie of the American Fur Company was determined to succeed.
He enlisted a trapper named Jacob Berger, who knew the language and had personal contacts. Berger went on a high-risk peace mission.
He managed to convince about 40 leading men to visit Fort Union, pledging his own scalp and horses as a guarantee against treachery.
And it worked. It led to a trade agreement and the establishment of Fort Pegan in 1831, the first real European foothold. The next year, they built the more defensible Fort Mackenzie.
But this success was short-lived. In 1837, the smallpox scourge hit the Missouri Valley.
A complete catastrophe. Despite precautions, the disease got on the steamer. The indigenous peoples camped near Fort Mackenzie grew suspicious of the delay in unloading the cargo and insisted it be brought up.
Culbertson, who was in charge, yielded to avoid an immediate attack.
And the result was horrific. The disease spread like wildfire. Culbertson later found a Peon village of 60 lodges completely empty, except for the dead. He estimated 6,000 deaths among the 3 main Blackfeet tribes.
This is a societal collapse.
And then, after that, came a deliberate act of violence. Between 1842 and 43, Francis Chardon and Alexander Harvey plotted a massacre of indigenous people who came to trade.
To kill them and steal their property?
It only partially succeeded, but it ignited such vengeance that Fort Mackenzie became untenable. Chardon had to abandon and burn it.
The site became known as Fort Brûlé, the burned fort.
So in 1844, the company recalled Alexander Culbertson to try and salvage the ruined trade.
And he did. He abandoned the tainted site, established a new post called Fort Lewis, and then in 1846 moved it to its final location.
In 1850, he rebuilt it with adobe and rechristened it Fort Benton in honor of Senator Thomas Benton, who was a key political ally for the company.
And this becomes the new goal, reaching Fort Benton by steamboat.
The final symbolic conquest of the river. By 1859, Captain John La Barge, Joseph's brother, on the Chippewa, gets within 15 miles of it.
An incredible achievement. 3,560 miles from the sea on an unimproved river.
And the next year, on July 2nd, 1860, the Chippewa and the Key West tie up right in front of Fort Benton. It's officially established as the practical head of navigation.
But even the most successful boats were still at risk. The Chippewa itself met a dramatic end.
It did. On a return trip in 1861, it caught fire at a place now called Disaster Bend.
And the cause was just carelessness.
Deckhands went into the hold with a lit candle trying to steal liquor. They got everyone off the boat safely and then set the burning vessel adrift because it was loaded with gunpowder. It eventually blew up downstream.
By this point, the mid-1850s, the focus is shifting again. Now it's about military and scientific conquest.
In 1855, the U.S. government buys Fort Pierre. It marks the beginning of the Army's systematic conquest of the Upper Missouri, led by General Harney.
And Harney had a peculiar way of demonstrating European power.
He did. There's an anecdote where he's in a council with 3,000 Sioux and decides to demonstrate the power of chloroform.
He's going to kill and bring to life again a dog.
He tells the surgeon not to use too much. The dog is successfully put under, but then the surgeon can't wake it up.
The demonstration of technological superiority fails.
And the Sioux just gave a very pragmatic critique. Medicine, too strong, too strong.
At the same time, you have serious scientific work happening, like the Stevens exploration in 1856.
That brought Lieutenant Governor K. Warren, a future Civil War general, and the geologist Dr. F.V. Hayden up the river on the St. Mary.
Warren was meticulously mapping the river from the pilot house.
And Captain La Barge assisted him greatly, stopping the boat whenever needed for accurate observations. It was a real collaboration between frontier knowledge and scientific rigor.
Dr. Hayden, the geologist, sounds like he was a bit reckless.
Enthusiastic but reckless. At Old Fort Clark, he was collecting fossils under a high bank when some young Arikara men started pelting him with pebbles.
And Hayden leveled his rifle at them.
La Barge saw it from the boat and yelled at him to stop, warning him he'd be a dead man if he fired. It shows how quickly things could escalate.
The river itself was always a threat, too, as shown by the great ice breakup in St. Louis in 1856.
It was an appalling spectacle. Not a thaw, but a river rise that pushed massive, thick ice downstream with the force of a glacier. It crushed boats like they were skiffs.
But La Barge saved his vessel, the St. Mary.
He was the only one. He got up steam and deliberately backed his boat out into the ice field away from the shore crush and drifted 20 miles downstream before he could get free. A masterful bit of piloting.
And it was on the following trip that La Barge had his final break with the American Fur Company.
It was an issue of honor. An arrogant company partner, a bourgeois, insulted the wife of the boat clerk. La Barge had promised the clerk's father he'd protect her.
So La Barge took direct action.
He grabbed the man, kicked him several times, and had him put ashore for the night.
But then the clerk, whose wife he had defended, reported La Barge for uncalled for severity, but left out the insult.
So La Barge, choosing not to defend himself, was let go by the company. It was only 3 years later that the clerk's father learned the truth and acknowledged La Barge was justified.
So after that, La Barge built his own boat, the Emily, in 1859.
A superb vessel. And it was during his trips that year that he encountered Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln was visiting the West, looking at real estate, and more importantly, the future route of the railroad.
He specifically sought out General Grenville Dodge, who was surveying for the Union Pacific. The detailed questions Lincoln asked in 1859 directly informed his decision as president in 1863 to make Council Bluffs the eastern terminus.
And La Barge met him on a river trip.
Most likely returning from Leavenworth. He remembered Lincoln as tall, slender, wearing a high hat, and always surrounded by an audience.
Lincoln spent a lot of time in the pilot house, asking La Barge about the fur trade and the indigenous peoples.
And at the end of the trip, he just made a simple request for La Barge to get him a fine buffalo robe.
The final anecdote is from 1860. La Barge's boat is stuck in the ice when he hears the news of Lincoln's election.
And his immediate reaction was a prediction. Up go all your enslaved people. He saw exactly what was coming.
It's incredible. In just 15 years, the river goes from being a quiet fur route to the absolute engine of continental migration.
An engine that drove a process that would, in the end, lead to the railroads that made the steamboats themselves obsolete. A period of profound and incredibly rapid change.
Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed learning something new. That's all for now, but in case you didn't notice, there are a lot more episodes on this subject available on this channel. If you're enjoying these historical podcasts, please like and subscribe and share with other history buffs.
While this is an AI recording, the research that has gone into this production is comprehensive and focuses on very specific moments in history, designed to bring as much detail to the listener as possible. Thanks again for listening in.